The cold winter of 1939 hung heavy over New York, the kind of night that made even the strongest men shiver. In a back room of a speakeasy on Harlem's west side, Bumpy Johnson sat alone at a table, the flickering candlelight casting sharp shadows across his face. His men were on the streets, watching the streets, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just facing the usual rival gangs or mobsters who sought to muscle in on his empire. Tonight, the threat was something far more dangerous, something no amount of muscle could intimidate. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, clad in a long coat, the collar turned up against the biting cold. It was Agent J. Edgar Hoover's best man, sent straight from Washington. His name was Harry Sloane, and he was the kind of man who exuded authority with every step, his polished shoes clicking on the floor as he crossed the room. He didn't sit. He didn't offer pleasantries. "You've been running things in Harlem for too long, Johnson," Sloane said, his voice calm, yet dripping with contempt. "The time has come to put an end to your little empire. The FBI doesn't deal in negotiation. We deal in enforcement." Bumpy's eyes never left the man standing before him. His posture didn't change, not even an inch. The smoke from his cigarette curled upwards lazily as he leaned back in his chair, unmoved. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. The stakes were high. The FBI had been after Bumpy Johnson for months, investigating his gambling rackets, his bootlegging, and his alleged ties to organized crime. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what the government would do to a man who dared to rule a kingdom without their consent. "You come here, on my turf, and tell me it's over?" Bumpy's voice was calm, almost too calm. "You don't get to tell me anything. Not on these streets." Sloane smirked, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "You think the people of Harlem care about you, Bumpy? They care about the money you bring, but not you. The moment the law comes down, they'll forget you faster than they'll forget the next man." Bumpy's face remained expressionless, but inside he could feel the challenge, the audacity of it all. He had been a king in these streets for too long to let some Fed waltz in and try to strip him of his power. He didn't just control Harlem, he controlled its heartbeat, and nobody, not the mafia, not the police, and certainly not the FBI, would take that from him. Bumpy Johnson was no ordinary man. His journey from the rough streets of Charleston, South Carolina, to the pinnacle of Harlem's criminal underworld was marked by resilience, shrewdness, and a deep sense of loyalty to his community. By 1939, he had ascended to the top of Harlem's hierarchy, not just as a gangster, but as a symbol of defiance against a system that sought to oppress and exploit black people. Harlem was a world unto itself, vibrant, turbulent, and alive with the dreams of those who had been forgotten by the rest of society. But in the midst of all that, there was Bumpy. He had grown up in the streets, learned the language of survival, and quickly became a force to be reckoned with. He wasn't just feared for his ruthlessness in business. He was respected for the way he treated his people. He protected Harlem's residents, ensured they had work, and defended them from outsiders, especially those who would come to exploit them. In return, they gave him their unwavering loyalty. It wasn't just the locals who gave him their respect, it was the city's most powerful figures, the ones in the shadows of power. The mafia, politicians, crooked cops, all knew Bumpy's name. He didn't just control the streets, he controlled the flow of money, and that made him untouchable. Harlem had a way of protecting its own, and Bumpy was the living embodiment of that protection. But the rise of organized crime across the country, coupled with the increasing pressure from the FBI, was a sign that even Harlem's king would eventually have to face a force that didn't play by the same rules. The federal government's increasing interest in cracking down on organized crime, especially following the rise of figures like Al Capone and the crackdown on prohibition, meant that Bumpy Johnson was on borrowed time. And when the FBI set its sights on him, he knew this wouldn't be a simple battle for his turf. It would be a battle for his very legacy. As Bumpy sat in the dimly lit room, the words from Agent Sloane still echoed in his mind. The feds had never stopped hunting him. They had tried raids, informants, and surveillance. They wanted to dismantle his empire, to prove that even the untouchable could fall under their scrutiny. But Bumpy wasn't a man who easily bent to pressure. The challenge wasn't just from Sloane, it came from the system itself, a system that had never played fair with men like Bumpy. He wasn't just a criminal in their eyes, he was a symbol of everything they despised. The FBI's mission wasn't just to capture Bumpy, it was to crush everything he represented. That night, Bumpy's mind raced as he considered his next move. He needed to send a message, both to the FBI and to the people who depended on him. Harlem had a way of rallying behind its own, and Bumpy's influence was stronger than ever. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just about evading capture. It was about proving that Harlem was untouchable, that its king was unshakable. But as much as Bumpy relied on the loyalty of his people, he knew that this battle would require more than just street smarts. It was about strategy, timing, and the ability to outmaneuver those who believed they had the upper hand. The feds had underestimated him before, and this time he wasn't going to let them forget who they were dealing with. In the coming days, Bumpy began making moves of his own, quiet, calculated steps to outsmart the FBI's investigation. He used his connections in the city to feed them misinformation, to plant doubt among the federal agents who were watching his every move. He wasn't going to let them make their next move without thinking twice. Meanwhile, Harlem continued to hum with life. Bumpy's people went about their business, keeping their heads down while he worked behind the scenes. But they all knew something was coming, and when it did, they would stand with him. They had no choice. They owed him too much. But even Bumpy knew that the feds would not be easily deterred. The battle for Harlem's soul had begun, and it was going to be one of the toughest of his life. The days following Bumpy's standoff with Agent Sloane were filled with calculated moves. The FBI, with its vast network and resources, was relentless in its pursuit. But Bumpy had his own web of connections. Men who worked the underground, corrupt officials who owed him favors, and street informants who had their ears to the ground. Bumpy had learned long ago that in order to outsmart an enemy, you had to be 3 steps ahead. He was playing a game that required more than just muscle. It required patience, precision, and the ability to navigate an unseen battlefield. One evening, as the winter chill set in, Bumpy sat with Big Jim in the back of a small, quiet restaurant tucked away in the heart of Harlem. Big Jim was a giant of a man, his presence a constant reassurance for Bumpy. He trusted him with his life. They had been through too much together. "Feds are getting bolder, Bumpy," Big Jim said, his voice low as he leaned in. "They're making moves, closing in on us from every side. We got eyes on us everywhere." Bumpy didn't flinch. His expression was as hard as stone. He knew the danger was real, but he had always thrived under pressure. The more the authorities pushed, the more he dug in his heels. "Let them come," Bumpy replied, his voice steady. "They think they can scare me? They don't know who they're dealing with. I run this town, Jim. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about what we built here, what we stand for." Big Jim nodded, understanding exactly what Bumpy meant. The streets of Harlem weren't just a backdrop for Bumpy's empire. They were a reflection of his life, his struggle, his fight for respect. Harlem had given him everything, and he wasn't about to let the FBI take it away. Across town, Agent Sloane was making his own moves, tightening the noose. The Bureau's investigation was becoming more aggressive. They had tapped phones, set up surveillance, and even tried infiltrating Bumpy's operations with informants. But they didn't know Harlem. They didn't understand the bond between Bumpy and his people. They didn't understand how deeply rooted he was in the fabric of this community. And they definitely didn't understand that Bumpy wasn't a man to be intimidated into submission. Sloane was convinced that the only way to bring Bumpy down was to isolate him, cut off his resources, and dismantle his support. But the more he pushed, the more Bumpy fought back. Every move Sloane made seemed to provoke a response from Harlem, a citywide collective defiance that was as powerful as it was invisible. Bumpy's empire wasn't just about crime. It was about community, and that community would stand with him. In the weeks that followed, the battle escalated. Bumpy took his war to the streets in subtle ways, quietly removing the FBI's eyes from Harlem, silencing their informants, and shutting down their efforts to gain leverage. He worked in the shadows, carefully orchestrating his next move. Every move was strategic. Every step was deliberate. The tension reached a boiling point when a key witness against Bumpy, a small-time operator named Tony the Rat Lanza, was found dead in the East River. The authorities immediately assumed foul play, and suspicions fell directly on Bumpy. But what they didn't realize was that Bumpy wasn't the one who had ordered the hit. In fact, Bumpy had long since realized that the death of Lanza would be the very thing that could turn the tide in his favor. It would force the FBI into a corner to make rash decisions, and that's when Bumpy would strike. It wasn't just about fighting the government. It was about demonstrating who controlled the streets, who had the real power. Bumpy wasn't going to let the FBI use Harlem as their battleground. He would show them that the people of Harlem didn't need federal intervention. They had their own justice, and it was time for the world to see that. It all came to a head one fateful night in February 1939 in the heart of Harlem. The FBI, desperate to break Bumpy's empire, had called in reinforcements, escalating their efforts to dismantle his network. They had organized a full-scale raid, several dozen agents armed to the teeth, storming through the streets in an attempt to catch Bumpy and his men off guard. But Bumpy had been prepared. Long before the FBI showed up, he had made sure his most trusted men were in place, waiting for the moment when the authorities would overstep their boundaries. They had been tracking the Fed's movements, feeding Bumpy information, and even placing false leads that would lead the agents down false paths. The raid itself was supposed to be the final blow to Bumpy's empire, an all-out assault that would shake Harlem's foundations. But what the FBI didn't know was that Bumpy wasn't just sitting in some hideout waiting to be caught. No, he had a plan that would make the feds realize they weren't just facing a criminal. They were facing a man who understood how to fight on his terms. At the center of the chaos, Bumpy stood tall, surrounded by his loyal men. The FBI agents flooded into the building, weapons drawn, their boots echoing through the halls. But the moment they stepped inside, they were met with resistance. Bumpy's men, hidden in the shadows, fought back with precision, not wild aggression. They didn't just fire shots, they made every shot count. The agents found themselves caught in an ambush, unsure of how to respond to the well-coordinated resistance. Bumpy's presence was undeniable, even in the thick of the chaos. He moved with purpose, his eyes sharp, scanning every corner. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the soul of Harlem. As the agents pushed forward, Bumpy and his men made their way through the building, closing off exits and securing the perimeter. It was a battle of wills, a showdown between the federal government and the streets of Harlem. Bumpy's legend wasn't just about his ability to run a criminal empire, it was about his ability to outmaneuver those who sought to control what was his. As the confrontation reached its peak, Bumpy came face to face with Agent Sloane. The two men stood in the middle of the chaos, surrounded by the sounds of gunfire and shouted orders. Sloane was breathless, his hand on his holstered weapon, but Bumpy's calm was unshakable. "This is it, Bumpy," Sloane said, his voice dripping with frustration. "You think you can keep running? You can't hide from the law forever." Bumpy's eyes locked onto Sloane's, and for a moment the room seemed to fall away. "You're right," Bumpy said, his voice quiet, but every word heavy with meaning. "I'm not running, but this—" He gestured to the battle around them. This is Harlem, and Harlem doesn't run from anyone." With that, Bumpy turned his back on Sloane, signaling his men to continue pushing back the agents. The confrontation wasn't over, but in that moment, Bumpy had made his point. The FBI might have come with the intent to crush him, but in the heart of Harlem, he was untouchable. The battle between Bumpy Johnson and the FBI raged through the night, but by dawn, the dust began to settle. The raid that had been orchestrated to bring down Harlem's king had instead revealed the extent of his power. The FBI, despite their resources, had failed to capture Bumpy. They had underestimated him. Bumpy and his men had fought tooth and nail, not just to protect their territory, but to send a message that Harlem was untouchable, and that no matter how many agents or informants the FBI sent, they could never take what was Bumpy's. By morning, the streets of Harlem were eerily quiet, but the aftermath was felt across the city. The FBI, though unwilling to admit their failure, retreated from the scene, their plans for a total takedown thwarted by Bumpy's foresight and the loyalty of his people. Harlem had stood strong, and Bumpy Johnson had proved once again that he was a force to be reckoned with. The aftermath rippled through the underworld and beyond. Rumors of the raid spread like wildfire, with whispers in every corner of New York. Bumpy had gone toe-to-toe with the FBI, and not only had he survived, he had made them look foolish in the process. In the days that followed, Harlem's streets buzzed with pride. The community, which had always stood behind Bumpy, now saw him as more than just a crime boss. He had become a hero, a symbol of defiance against a system that had tried to crush him and his people. The FBI's failure in Harlem wasn't just a setback for the law, it was a defeat for anyone who thought they could intimidate the heart of New York's black community. Meanwhile, Agent Sloane, who had led the charge against Bumpy, found himself in a difficult position. The FBI had been humiliated, and Sloane, as the man in charge, took the brunt of the blame. He had underestimated Harlem, underestimated Bumpy, and now the Bureau's reputation had taken a hit. He could already hear the whispers from higher-ups in Washington, questioning his ability to handle the case. It wasn't just Bumpy Johnson who had come out victorious, it was Harlem itself. But Bumpy, ever the strategist, knew that this victory wasn't enough to end the fight. The FBI would regroup. They would plan their next move, and Bumpy couldn't afford to relax. But for now, he enjoyed the taste of victory. Harlem had stood with him, and he had earned their respect all over again. That evening, as Bumpy stood on the rooftop of his building overlooking the streets he had fought so hard to protect, he knew that he had achieved something monumental. Not only had he defeated an enemy far stronger than any of the ones he had faced before, but he had solidified his place as the unchallenged ruler of Harlem. The events of that night in 1939 would go down in Harlem's history as one of its defining moments. Bumpy Johnson's battle with the FBI wasn't just a clash between a man and the law, it was a battle for the very soul of Harlem. And it was a battle he had won. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson wasn't just about his criminal empire or his wealth. It was about the way he commanded respect, the way he protected the people who had placed their trust in him. Harlem wasn't just his territory, it was his kingdom, and he ruled it with the kind of respect that couldn't be bought or threatened away. For the people of Harlem, the victory over the FBI was a victory for them all. It wasn't just about Bumpy's survival, it was about their survival. It was about standing up to the system that had tried to silence them for so long. It was about proving that Harlem would never back down. Bumpy's reputation spread far beyond the borders of Harlem. The man who had faced off against the FBI and come out on top was now a legend, a man whose name was spoken with reverence and awe, not just in the streets of Harlem, but in the underworld of New York and beyond. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a symbol of resistance, a living testament to the power of community and loyalty. Even the most powerful crime families in the city couldn't ignore Bumpy's victory. While they may have once viewed him as an outsider, a man to be tolerated, now they saw him as a peer, a force to be reckoned with. No longer could they simply walk into Harlem and take what they wanted. No longer could they push him around. Bumpy Johnson had made his mark, and no one, no matter how powerful, would forget it. And Harlem? Harlem continued to thrive. The community, which had once been torn apart by poverty and racism, was now united behind a man who had shown them that no one, not even the federal government, could take away what they had built. Bumpy's legacy was secure. He had proven that when you stand up for what's right, when you refuse to bow to authority, you don't just survive, you become a legend. The battle between Bumpy Johnson and the FBI wasn't just a personal victory for a man who ruled the streets. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been oppressed, who had ever been told they didn't matter. Bumpy Johnson's stand against the FBI wasn't just about crime. It was about justice, about proving that the power of the streets could stand up to the might of the federal government. Harlem had always been a place of strength, of resilience. But it wasn't until Bumpy Johnson stepped into the ring with the FBI that the world saw what Harlem was truly made of. It wasn't just a community of people. It was a force, a unified front that refused to be broken. Bumpy Johnson's name would live on in the annals of history, not just for his criminal dealings, but for the way he became a symbol of power, respect, and justice. In the end, it wasn't about money or power. It was about standing up for your people, no matter the odds. This wasn't just about one man's pride. This was about a community's dignity. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world what respect really means.